Hi everyone. So today I want to do something a little bit different. Instead of covering a very long process or a very specific process, I wanted to actually just go through and do kind of a speed run on some data that I got recently that I wasn't really wanting to do hours and hours and hours worth of processing on. I really just wanted to see how good I could get in a relatively short amount of time. In this case, total processing time was about half an hour to 45 minutes. As I go through this, you'll see a couple cuts here and there where either I went to go have some dinner or was kind of backtracking on something that I forgot to do, that kind of thing. But just to show you that if you have kind of a plan, what you can get for a reasonable amount of effort, not taking a ridiculous amount of time, but not doing nothing to it either. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on playing through the video that I captured as I was going through that. So to start off with, what I'm looking at here tonight is the Elephant Trunk Nebula, and I took this as Ha RGB. So I took red, green, and blue channels and a hydrogen alpha channel. As you can see from the red, green, and blue, none of them are that deep. I think I probably got about an hour each on the red, green, and blue. So I knew I wasn't going to have a crazy amount of color data. But ultimately I wanted that hydrogen alpha, which I think I took probably about 3 hours of, to really pop out the detail in the nebula here. So I'm starting off with doing a dynamic crop to just get off the edges where the integration maybe had some artifacts and things like that, because I always dither my images. That means I've always got kind of fuzzy edges. And then once I've done that on one of them, I go into the History Explorer and take that exact same dynamic crop process and apply it to the other ones. And that's going to make sure that even though I've cropped in, all the images are still aligned because they've been cropped in by the exact same amount in the exact same places. And then once I've done that to all four, let's see what the next thing I did was. If you notice, I've got a set of icons on the right-hand side there that are saved. I save a set of process icons. That way it kind of gives me a little rule of thumb of where I need to go. So the next thing that I'm doing down that list is the channel combination. So just taking the red, the green, the blue, and combining those images together to see what I've got from a color context. And surprise, surprise, it kind of looks like junk at the beginning. You can see I've got a lot of red on one side, a lot of green on the other side, and that's what the background extractor is for. So I'm just going to do an automatic background extractor here, run it on it, and you'll see that the model that comes up, if it does its job well, should pretty well match with that color gradient that I was seeing. And it does, so I'm okay with leaving that as it is. Stretching it again, now that image looks a lot more natural and a lot more the way that it should. So now the colors are roughly balanced, but I thought about doing a background neutralization, but for color calibration, most of the time I like to use the photometric color calibration process, and that does kind of a background neutralization as part of it. So the first thing I do is I pick one of the raw files, one of the integrated ones, integrated individual channels, and say acquire the fits info from there, because it's going to plate solve this image first to figure out what part of the sky it's looking at, and then that process compares star colors against what it believes they should be in general for where it is and the average kind of star colors in a galaxy, and then fits, kind of goes through and does changes on the color calibration to fit it to that model. And so this takes a minute or two to run, depending on how big your data set is and that kind of thing. But it's a relatively quick process. And I've found that for most of my images, this normally does a pretty good job of getting the color balance, very, very naturalistic when you're taking red, green, and blue data. Obviously, when you're taking narrowband data, this is a process you don't need to do at all. So I have a go through and run here. And there we go. So you can see the models on the right there, everything kind of lined up pretty well. And then restretching it again, you can see things don't look dramatically different, but it did balance those colors out a little bit more. So next I'm going to extract just the luminance, just the grayscale detail data here. And I am in general going to use this as a mask because I'm planning on doing some noise reduction here. So I want to do a histogram transformation on that, just based off of the default screen transfer, auto stretch. And then I'm going to apply that mask to the main image. And then I'm going to invert the mask because what I want to do is attack the stuff that isn't bright in this image and protect everything that is, so it doesn't get as much noise reduction if it's got a lot of detail in it. So once I've done that, I go to the multi-scale linear transformer. These are just some of the default, works well on most image settings that I have in there. There's a lot of deep dive stuff on how to use that, but just taking kind of my settings that work well most of the time. I'm going to try that on small area here and see how well it works. And it looks like it's smoothed out pretty well. I'm sure I could do a little bit better if I really tweaked it, but I'm not trying to do something perfect. I'm trying to do something pretty fast. So I'm also going to check it against the detail core area of the nebula and make sure it didn't completely destroy that. It doesn't look too bad to me, especially since I'm going to do some sharpening later. So now that I'm happy with how it worked on the previews, I'm just going to go ahead and apply it to the whole image. And we're done. So zooming back in just to double check that something didn't look different from what it looked like in the preview. Things look good there. So I'm going to change my identifier here so that I know that this is my RGB that I'm holding on to. And just kind of resetting stuff here, removing the mask because I don't need it anymore, as I get ready to actually stretch the image itself. So as you can tell, after you do noise reduction, it kind of changes up what your auto stretch is going to look like. And then what I like to do is kind of mess with the screen transfer function when I'm getting ready to do my final stretch. That normally does a little too much on the stretching, in my opinion. So I play around with kind of these sliders overall in there until I feel like I've got something that has a decent amount of depth to it and isn't completely overly stretched. And then I'll drag that over to the histogram transformation and do it as the permanent stretch. If you notice, I don't have it super duper bright here, and part of the reason why is because I'm going to be using that hydrogen alpha to really pump up some of this a little bit more. So speaking of that, now I'm going to go to work on that. Make sure I didn't have any extra work other than just the dynamic crop on it. And so what I'm really trying to do on this one is just get its stretch right. If I had really wanted to be a little bit more crazy, I'd do things like deconvolution and noise reduction on this one as well. But I'm just trying to go for something that's pretty straightforward. Once again, I'm just going to kind of mess with the levels here. Now on this one, because this is going to be really where I'm boosting a lot of my red and things like that, which is really what's prevalent in this nebula, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive on the stretch here. I really want to brighten up the detail areas and darken up the background a little bit. So this one will be a little bit more aggressive than the RGB was. And so there we have the hydrogen alpha one. So now The next bits here are moving into how do I combine these things together, right? So just going to do a little bit of kind of re-stretching up just a little bit more to bring out a little bit more of the color so that when I add things back together and combine it all back together, it doesn't feel washed out with the grayscale data added in. And then instead of extracting luminance, now I'm extracting the color channels. So now I'm back to RGB images again, but they've been color balanced and everything else. So as long as I don't change their histogram levels, they're going to continue to be in balance with each other. So what I'm doing here now is I'm going to take that red channel, I'm going to add it to the hydrogen alpha channel, and I'm going to blend them. So if you see, I'm doing the red times 0.1, the other one times 4 or 5, that kind of thing, and that's going to let me get kind of an average together of those two images, and weighting the hydrogen alpha a little bit more than the red data was. And then once I have that, then we can go in and do an RGB combine, because I'm going to call that my luminance as my detail layer. And combining those together, you can see the detail really does pop out a lot more. I'm a little washed out, so I'm going to start messing around with the saturation level to try to bring the colors back up. Probably went one way or another, the right or wrong way there. You can see I'm kind of changing how much I've stretched my image. I'm just kind of playing around with it a little bit here to see what gives me a blend that I'm fairly happy with, that kind of thing. Because I really want to make sure that background isn't completely washed out. Alright, so we're going to try it again here. And now we've got a lot more detail in there, but we don't have a whole lot of color data. So what I'm going to do here is try to fix that. So I really want those reds and things to start coming out more. So I'm going to take pixel math, and we're going to come in and add in our red data to the hydrogen alpha again. And this time, instead of it being the luminance layer, the detail layer that we're going for, this time we're going to be doing it as a new red layer. As you can see, I'm kind of abandoning some of what I had done there in the luminance side, because it was really that red that I needed to bring in a little bit more into it so that it could get boosted. Alright, and then that's great, except I accidentally did that on my main image instead of creating a new one. So that happens all the time with pixel math for me. So I'm going to make the new red image, and there's my new red. So now we're going to move on to the LRGB combination. Because I have separate red, green, and blue channels now, I can go ahead and apply that, my new red image that I've made to each one of these. So I can use my new red instead of the original red. What I'm running across here that I hadn't realized yet, and it'll take me a minute here, is that even though it's a grayscale image, I was sending it out as RGB color. It needs to be grayscale if you're going to use it for the LRGB combination. So as you can see, everybody makes mistakes. Figure it out and move on. So now I can find it in the list. So I'm going to do my new red, then the old green, and the old blue. And actually, I think I was doing these a little bit backwards too. And then for that luminance, I'm going to use my luminance layer that I was making. Or I'm just going to use HA on its own. So now, bringing those together, we'll see a little bit different than when we just tried to add in a different luminance with the same colors. So it was washed out before. Now you're going to see there's a lot more red in this area. There's also a lot of blue around the stars themselves. We're going to deal with that in just a minute here. But so you can see that background, the nebula really stands out from where it was in the background. And, we can play around with the saturation to bring the colors back up. So trying it again, we'll see if we like this one better. And yeah, so now there's a lot more red in. There's also a lot more blue and a lot more green as well. But there is a lot more contrast in that detail. But once again, still seeing it as kind of a little washed out. So we come back here and we're going to try to redo that luminance and not just use the HA on it. So we're going to add the RGB luminance to the HA luminance, just like we did a few times before. This one I did do it as grayscale this time, so when I come back in for my LRGB combine, it should show up in my list. There it is. And then we want to use our new red. So you can tell we've left the blues and greens alone, but the luminance and the red have both been blended with that hydrogen alpha to both boost the color as well as the detail and contrast on the image overall. Now, this one kind of has the best of everything that we've been looking at. It's got a lot of color, it's got a lot of detail, it isn't as washed out, that kind of thing. We're also going to try it again here with the saturation boosted a little bit more and seeing what we come up with. All right, so when we compare this one to the one that we had before, this one in general I like the colors on better, I think. We still got a little bit of a green tint, a little bit of a blue tint, so we're going to run the SCNR to remove the green. And now things are a lot more blue, but a lot of that green noise that was in there is gone. And a lot of the blue that's in there isn't because of blue bias, it's because of blue fringing that we'll deal with. So next thing is Another multi-scale linear transform, but instead of noise reduction, we're doing kind of just some general sharpening here. And then the unsharp mask to do some additional sharpening. And this is just kind of running down my normal processes that I use. The next one, morphological transformation. So this is star reduction. So after we run this, the stars should seem a lot dimmer, a little bit smaller than what they were before. And there we go. And that really helps the nebula pop out. But you always want to come in and make sure that things aren't chewed up too much or that kind of thing. And I'm kind of going back and forth between how much I want to do here. And I think if I remember correctly, I think I stuck with this one here. And then this exponential transformation just kind of gives a little brightness pop that I like to do at the end there. And then that's pretty much it from the basics in processing this through PixInsight. Now, to get rid of this color fringing, I want to take this into Lightroom. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and save a TIFF of this. I saved it as an XISF first just so that I had it for PixInsight, and then I'm going to save a TIFF copy. I'm going to put it to 16-bit. I really don't need 32 bits in Lightroom. I'm not even sure it would be able to handle it well. Oh, sorry, I guess I'm starting with Photoshop first. Nope, I think I realized my mistake. Yep, that was Lightroom I needed to go into. And Lightroom has a whole bunch of handy features that can help out on just tweaking some of these things that might be a little bit more complicated to do in PixInsight. But one of the things that I really like is their ability to deal with color fringing, which in this case a lot of times they'll call the chromatic aberration, especially when doing RGB data. Most blue filters tend to have some haloing, especially at the lower end. I don't have extremely expensive filters, so instead of spending a ridiculous amount on, say, Astrodon filters, I can actually just come down to the chromatic aberration corrector, and what you do is you get an eyedropper, and then you kind of bring it over the part that's causing you problems. You click, and it goes away. It's really, really a great tool, and you can see immediately that blue that we were feeling was just awful is pretty much gone. So now, I'll do a couple of things in here to kind of mess around and see if I can find any other little tweaks that I like, kind of some of the contrast and layers adjustments. And so I'm going to be playing around with this for a minute or two, just to do some of the things that sometimes are just a little bit more cumbersome in PixInsight. So if I happen to be here already to fix this part, why not do it the easy way here? Now, the part that I'm looking for is in the very dark dust nebulas. It was starting to get a little chewed. It was getting a little clipped. So I wanted to make sure that I kept it still looking natural and looking like the dust that it is, as opposed to just a bunch of black pixels. So just playing with very subtle changes on the curves. All of this is kind of personal preference. There's no absolute right or wrong way to do it, other than just what looks good to your eye. Bringing the red itself up just a bit. And then coming in and really looking at different pieces. I love the quick zoom in and out that you have with Lightroom. Some additional noise reduction that can be done in here that's very easy in terms of the usage of it, unlike a lot of the other tools that are out there. Just kind of playing around with it and watching how it's going. Once again, a lot of this stuff can be very subtle until you've gone too far and ruined your image. So kind of want to play around with it, undo, go back in, redo. Definitely take a look at those low signal areas versus the high signal areas and seeing how well everything's working there. A lot of times in these sliders I will overdo it a bit on purpose just so that I can see what it's going to look like when I've for sure done it wrong, and then back off of it a bit. At this point, this is feeling pretty solid. Just doing a couple little look arounds at the dark areas, especially to make sure that they don't look too unnatural, too noisy, too overcorrected, that kind of thing, since I've been focusing a lot on the bright signal areas. But they're also still a little bright, so I'm going to see if I can darken them up without hurting things too much. And this is really where the longer exposure total integration time really helps, because you end up with a lot more contrast that comes out, a lot more dynamic range the more exposure time you have total. So once again, really trying to make sure that that area isn't chewed up. So you can tell that difference between when it's black and when it's kind of that just on the edge of it. And so that might mean that the background's a little lighter than you might want it to be. And there's certainly things that can be done with masking and all sorts of other stuff to get more and more granular on it. But once again, I'm trying to figure out, bang for the buck in a short amount of time here. Because at this point, we're almost done. So now we're going to go ahead and export this TIFF back out. And so just looking over the settings, making sure I'm putting things where I want them to be. Just double checking through to make sure that it's not going to lose any, isn't going to be turning it into a JPEG or anything like that. So we do our quick export, and then we can come back in and do a compare and final kind of cropping and all that in PixInsight here. So now overlaying the two of these and kind of looking between them here, you can really tell those blue stars just disappeared, and that's what really was causing the biggest amount of trouble with our image. So I'm just going to look for a little final histogram transformation here. Once again, trying not to chew up the dark areas too much, but really want to make sure that the nebula itself is what pops here. Make sure that those dark areas are not too messed up, but we're going to zoom in and take a look here. Yeah, and it seems like I'm not seeing a ton of the pixelation just go into pure black when I'm going back and forth there. But a lot of the lightness from the outside has come down. Similarly, playing around with just kind of some final curves. And once again, all of this is personal preference, and all of this, you can spend hours and hours trying to get it just right. But a lot of times in these images, you're never really done. You may come back to these years afterwards and play around with them. Or in my case, you may publish it and then come back 2 days later and make it better. There's a point where you have to say, you know what, I think that's good enough, or good enough for now, and not letting perfect be the enemy of good. So kind of just turning on and off that preview, seeing whether or not I like it better or worse. Bringing the saturation up just a little bit. Saturation's always tricky because you want it to be as bright and colorful as possible, but if you go too far, it really looks unnatural. And that can be fine for narrowband images. But honestly, I think as humans, we have that view of when something looks overly colorful and just not feeling real. And so at this point, I think this is about where I called it quits on making the changes. I think the color and everything was starting to look really good. It had a decent amount of contrast in it. The object was there, which is always sometimes the first thing you really want to make sure is right, and that kind of thing. So at that point, it was really a matter of, okay, now how do I want to take care of this from here? How do I want to go through and start slicing and dicing this up? Because the Elephant Trunk Nebula is a great wide field target, but the trunk, so to speak, itself is a pretty small kind of field. So I think what I decided to do here was actually go ahead and do a crop as well as the wide field kind of final to hold in there. And then we're going to come back in and do our crop. And then there's our crop there. And so that gives a good mix of the area that's around it, both in and outside the nebula, as well as really highlighting out, in my opinion, the elephant trunk itself. We save that up, and that is it. At this point, we now have the finished images. Took just a little over half an hour worth of total processing time for messing around with it, outside of integrating the actual, calibrating and integrating the images to begin with. So there's a lot that you can do in just a short amount of time if you kind of have your settings kind of already in mind that work a lot of the times, and you're willing to kind of just quickly play around and tell yourself in your head, I think that's good enough for now. So that's it for this time. I hope that was helpful for you guys. Hopefully, I know we all fall into that trap of taking a lot of time on these images, but sometimes it's good to see, how much bang for your buck can you get in a dedicated half hour, right? So until next time, I wish everybody clear skies. Thanks.